Cristian, we are live.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to welcome all the people who attend this educational content event, which is organized by the Romanian American University from Bucharest. I'm Cristian Presură. I'm a physicist. I'm a Romanian, but I work in the Netherlands. And I would like, first of all, to also thank all the sponsors who made this possible event, and also to the two panelists who are the invited guests of today, Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss. Can you hear us, Richard and Lawrence?
Yes. Yes, can hear you well. Thanks.
Thank you for coming. We are very, very pleased to have you here and very honored at the same time. I would like to introduce first Lawrence Krauss, who is very known in the physics community, but I would say not really outside the physics community. We are physicists, Lawrence, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
And Lawrence is a popularizer and a researcher as well. He's a cosmologist, so he works on the history of the Big Bang and all the stuff, and also on the particle physics, because in order to understand the Big Bang and the evolution of the universe, it's very useful to know particle physics. He is known also for his contribution and his proposal, which was that basically most of the energy of the universe is in the empty space, which is quite unusual. But that thing was proven, and actually Nobel Prize was awarded for this. And at the same time, Lawrence is also a popularizer. He wrote a few books. I have here Universe from Nothing, which is Universul din Nimic. This is, Lawrence, the Romanian translation of your book.
Oh, great.
Which I read, and I was very, very pleased. I know that you are working now and actually just published The Physics of Climate Change, which I thought that was a great idea because when I was a physicist, I wanted to know the physics of climate change. You can also watch Lawrence on his podcast, The Origin, and I advise you to listen to the last podcast, which was made with Sabine Hossenfelder, another physicist. Thank you again, Lawrence, for this. This is a real honor for us.
Well, it's an honor for me, and I'm really pleased and impressed how you put it all together. It's great to be part of this with Richard.
As for Richard Dawkins, you know, Richard Dawkins is well known in the biology community because he's a biologist, but he's also well known outside the biology community. So I would just spare, you know, because he's very well known. He wrote many books. And instead of saying what Richard Dawkins did, which I think almost everybody in Romania knows, I would really like to take the opportunity to thank Richard Dawkins for his work of lifetime, because his work inspired all the scientists around the world. And for me, it's the only thing I would like to say is thank you very much, Richard Dawkins, very much for your contribution to all of us, because you contributed not also to science, but to us as a people.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's very honoring. Thank you.
Yes, how this discussion will go, we have about 6 questions I have prepared for our panelists, and that will take about 40 minutes. And then after that, I will take the questions from the audience. So please feel free to put questions. And in the last 20 minutes, so the whole event will take 1 hour and something. And the last 20 minutes, I will take your questions. So I will start first with questions for the panelists. We will discuss first the subject of science and religion. And I have basically 2 different questions for the 2 of you. You may answer in any order, but I will start my question to Lawrence and then to Richard. The question to Lawrence refers to free will. The point is the following. In physics, we know that the atoms follow the rules of physics. And then in biology and chemistry, we know that the neurons follows the laws of atoms. And then in neuroscience, we know that thoughts is basically has like the structure, what the neurons do, what the signals they give. So in other words, thoughts also follow the rules of the neuron. So some people say that from this follows that actually our thoughts always follow the physical laws. And in this way, they say there is no free will. So I would like you, Lawrence, to comment on this. And to Richard, I have the question, which is relating more to the meaning of life without God, because you wrote God Delusion. We all read the book, and I have young people coming to me and say, Cristian, I cannot believe in God because I do not trust the Bible. What is there that cannot be true? But on the other hand, I miss God because then I'm alone in the universe. And if I think of myself, what is the meaning of my life? Because on one hand, there is no afterlife. So whatever I do, I don't get any reward after afterlife. And the second point, he says, is the following: whatever I do in this world is going to disappear at the end of the universe. So whatever I do, there is no meaning. What can I say to such a person? What would you say to such a person?
Okay, so let's see. It looks like I'll answer your question, and Richard will respond. And just so people in the audience understands, as well as Cristian, Richard and I have done many events together, and I think we'll both perhaps be free to comment on the other's questions as well, because Richard
for sure, please
thoughts
do
on free will, and I certainly have thoughts on meanings. But let me begin with your question, which is a very interesting one, and the answer is that we are indeed physical beings, and we are subject to the laws of physics, and physics is the laws of physics are deterministic. Even the laws of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, many people like to use quantum mechanics as an out for free will. But the laws of quantum mechanics are in the mathematical terms what are called second order differential equations. And if you define the initial state, you can determine the final state. So the wave function, which is the fundamental quantity in quantum mechanics, is a completely deterministic quantity. What you measure based on that wave function is probabilistic. But the laws of physics are deterministic. So at a fundamental level, if you want to say, there is no free will. However, the interesting thing is that the world is a complex place made of many, many particles interacting and many, many phenomena, including chaos, where from an initial state many different divergent final states can happen. And so while a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about free will, I don't quite understand the worry. We live in a world which is for all intents and purposes indistinguishable from a world in which there's free will. There's so many antecedents to any effect that it's virtually impossible to determine the future or what the causes of every action is. Just like I can't determine the position of every particle in this room, and I treat them randomly. I treat it as a random gas, and for all intents and purposes, it is a random gas, but all the particles are following trajectories that are determined by the laws of physics. So we live in a world which is essentially indistinguishable from a world in which free will happens, because things are so complex. And that means we need to treat ourselves as responsible for our actions and all, but understand that at some basic level, the laws of physics ultimately determine the future, but it's so complicated that we need not worry about that fundamental fact, and we can act as if and feel as if we're responsible for our actions. So, in my mind, that's the way out of a world in which, at a fundamental level, the future is determined.
If I may comment very shortly, it's a deterministic world with many, 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 many possibilities. It's a world full of possibilities.
Yeah, and we can't determine all the possibilities in advance because there's so many things that impact on the future that we can go on living as if what I decided to say right now was something that I just came up with, instead of at some level something that was determined beforehand.
What if in a court of law somebody is accused of murder saying, "It wasn't me, Your Honor, it was my molecules that did it"? Well, you couldn't get away with that. But on the other hand, you can say, "I was insane," or a doctor can get up and say, "This was done under conditions of insanity." But what's the difference?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think, Richard, I think the difference is that at some level in the world we describe things differently. For example, it's useless to describe the behavior of the coronavirus by talking about the quantum mechanics of what's going on. We describe the dynamics and the behavior of the coronavirus using laws essentially a biology of how viruses work and how antibodies work. And ultimately, we describe humans on a different scale. And we hope, and this is the thing, we hope that our descriptions of humans on a larger scale are equally scientific. I think you and I probably suspect that a lot of psychology is, because it's more difficult to do experiments and isolate people. It's certainly a lot more difficult than describing accurately atoms. And Cristian and I, both physicists, I always say, as you know, Richard, that I don't do biology because it's so hard and physics is so easy.
Let me come to the other question about the meaning of life and the. I think it was a student, was it, Cristian, who was in despair because he couldn't think his life had any meaning. Well, one answer to that would be it's just tough. I mean, too bad if your life hasn't got a meaning. Get over it. Grow up. That's a rather callous answer. I find enormous meaning in life, finite though it is. I know my life is going to end. All our lives are going to end. Even if you believe that there's some kind of miracle, you can go on living for hundreds of years. Eventually, the universe is going to come to an end. So there is no ultimate future for us, but that all the more reason to grab the present and live your life as certainly as if it's about to end, which it is eventually. Enjoy your life, be good, try to make life good for other people. If you ask me as a biologist, what is the meaning of life? I would say it's the meaning of life is the propagation of genes. That does not mean that I think we should all go out and start madly trying to propagate our genes. It's much more subtle than that. We live our lives we give our lives meaning by wanting to, in my case, write books, or to give lectures, or to enjoy warm human company, enjoy music, enjoy literature. There are all sorts of ways in which your life can have meaning. And the fact that ultimately neither biology nor physics, indeed, gives your life ultimate meaning is not something to make you groan in despair. It's something to make you wake up, live your life properly, stand tall, face up to reality, and enjoy it.
Let me add to what Richard said, because I think he, as usual, he put it beautifully. But I think the fact, if you think about it, if you require understanding what the universe wants to give your life meaning, it's kind of almost sad in a way. It's giving up your fundamental role in determining what you do with your life and why you do it. And so in a sense you gain rather than lose by recognizing the universe doesn't care what's happening and isn't created for you, and it empowers you in an important way, and it makes that meaning even greater and more special.
I would continue to this line because Richard said, as a biologist, what is the meaning of life as a biologist? And I think that the biology, in a sense, is a beautiful way in which organisms become more and more complex. And I look at these documentaries where you find creatures which are very complex and do something very surprisingly because they are very, very complex. And I was wondering, how do you see the future of biology, Richard? Are we going to have organisms which are more and more and more complex? And is there a meaning in this?
There is no drive in biological evolution towards greater complexity unless greater complexity is favored by natural selection. And very often it is. It certainly is in human evolution, at least in recent times. But in other parts of the animal kingdom, there is no evolutionary drive towards complexity. In parasites, for example, there tends to be a drive towards simplicity. They lose parts of themselves. They become shapeless masses instead of complicated things with legs. So there is no drive towards anything in evolution unless natural selection favors it. Now, natural selection does favor it in humans, and so you could reasonably ask whether there's going to be a future human species, Homo futurus or something like that, which is more complicated. And that will only be true if the people who have the most children now and in the future are the people who are the most complex. They have the biggest brains, something like that. Certainly in the case of brains, there's no evidence that bigger-brained, cleverer, more intelligent humans are the ones who are having the most children. Quite the contrary.
Let me add to that because and Richard's made this point very clear, and as someone who hears people talking about this on the outside, it's really important to realize, as Richard has stressed, that there, a lot of people understand evolution, but they think it has some direction, and it's completely, in principle, random. It's based on natural selection. It's based on external property. It's not as if evolution is always producing better beings or more complex beings or anything else. It's got no direction, and that's very important. But as far as the future, let me just add to, while it's not clear that humans reproducing are going to, it's sort of cultural evolution for humans has become much more significant than biological evolution. We're controlling, in some sense, our own biology by determining the environment around us rather than the other way around. But the one thing that the Homo futurus may not be Homo at all, in the sense that the more complex beings that may eventually be created may be ones that we create ourselves, namely artificial intelligence.
That's much more likely. I mean, it is true that cultural evolution is immensely fast. Maybe 6 orders of magnitude faster, perhaps, than biological evolution. And that's what really driving us at the moment.
Talking about cultural evolution.
I can't hear you, Cristian. I think maybe you're. There we go.
Now you should hear me. I'm unmuted.
Okay, that's easier.
Yes. Talking about cultural evolution, we also have cultural problems. And one of these are the anti-vaxxers. We are now in the pandemic, and a lot of people in Eastern Europe are not vaccinated. And I have 2 questions of you, and you may answer as you like. The first one is, what would be the public policies towards these anti-vaxxers? How can we stop, let's say, the message they say that we should not get vaccinated? And the second question would be from a guy who does not want to be vaccinated because he's afraid of the vaccine, of the side effects. What would you say towards such a person, that it's good to be vaccinated?
Richard, why don't you begin?
Okay. Well, the person who's afraid of being vaccinated needs to be told the comparison between the side effects of vaccination, which are very small, and the horrific effects of the disease itself. It's a simple calculation, and unfortunately, side effects get more publicity than they deserve. The resistance to vaccination often comes not from people who are necessarily just afraid of being vaccinated, but people who, I think especially in America, feel it's an infringement of their personal liberty. They feel that it's fine for people who want to get vaccinated, by all means let them get vaccinated, but why should I get vaccinated? And I wonder whether they fully understand that it is an antisocial act to not be vaccinated, because the facts and the theory of epidemiology being what they are, the virus needs unvaccinated people in order to keep going. If everybody was vaccinated, it couldn't keep going. The epidemic would die out. You are performing a socially valuable act to society by getting vaccinated. It isn't just a matter of protecting yourself and exercising your freedom to refrain from protecting yourself. What you're doing is roughly the equivalent, but in a milder way, of driving on the wrong side of the road, because it's your freedom to do so.
Richard, I want to pick up on that point, because that's really important. I think that people realizing that they say, well, look, I won't get vaccinated because I'm young and I can get the virus and probably survive, and why should I worry about a vaccine? And the answer is, we have a social contract. We are in a society. We have others, and we have to recognize that we're constrained. And so you're young, but if you happen to be walking around with carrying the virus, even if you're asymptomatic, you may interact with someone who's older and effectively cause them to get the disease, and then in some cases cause them to die. So it's ultimately not just yourself you're thinking about. It's a social contract, and that's why, to get back to your first question, in some sense, I think that you can't force I mean, you can't physically force people to get vaccinated, but I think what you can do is make it, since it's a social issue, you can make it socially difficult to function without being vaccinated. For example, where I live right now, I can't go into a store or a restaurant without showing a card that shows I've been vaccinated. So I think the way we have to say is it's fine, if people for some reason or other don't want to get vaccinated, that's okay, but they have to realize that their social interactions will therefore be limited, and it's up to them to decide which is more important. And then it becomes a personal decision. It's not as if police are coming to force you and drag you to be vaccinated. You can decide, okay, I'm going to just stay at home, and if that's what you want to do, then that's what happens. And the other thing I will add to what Richard said at the beginning is that people have a very hard. It's been shown that people aren't very good at risk analysis, and somehow people seem to, because sometimes the risks of a vaccine are publicized. They don't realize that, of course, the risks of the disease on average, the number of people killed, the number of people having problems is much, much greater than that from a vaccine. And once again, for people who are afraid of vaccines, there's just a huge history. We've gotten rid of smallpox because of vaccines. We vaccinate our kids against measles. The underlying biological mechanisms of creating antibodies, we understand that because of the beauty and the wonderful work of biologists. It's a tribute to the human mind that biologists have figured out ways to mimic the human immune system and promote it. And it's such a shame that we don't use that knowledge. And so we should celebrate this instead of fearing it.
Thank you very much. I like the way you said it's a social contract anyway. And going to the next question, I was wondering if also maybe science is not also a social contract. Because in a sense, there are many people who say, especially in the countries which are not well developed, they say, why would you need science? We can live as our ancestors lived. Why would you need science? So for them, maybe they didn't sign this social contract. And going further to that, to this idea is basically the importance of science for public policy, health, climate change, and so on and so forth, but also for usual people. And adding to that, I have the second question, like research. Why would a country who is not well developed, is there a sense, would they do research? Is there a good idea for them to do research? Why not let the well-developed countries to do research and they get other things rather than research?
Let me jump into that second question first, because it's very important. The point is an undeveloped country becomes developed by being involved in research, in the sense that the not only is the way out of poverty based on in the modern world by learning how to develop technologies and building education, but even in the United States, it's been shown that 50% of the current gross national product of the United States is based on fundamental research that was done a generation or two earlier, and in the modern world, the economic health of people in your country will depend in some sense on the technological and scientific infrastructure in your country. And so various countries, and you've seen how there have been a variety of countries that have literally pulled themselves up by their bootstraps by investing in research and realizing the importance. If you look at Singapore and Korea, they spend a tremendous amount of money in research because they realize that ultimately, in a competitive modern world in which science and technology drives prosperity, that in order to enhance their local economies, getting involved in research is important. From a personal perspective, the vitally important thing is that every public policy, everything you can think of, health, energy, security, and economic development, has a scientific component. And if you're free to try and take actions based on fairy tales, but if you want to prosper and succeed, you should base your actions on reality, which is really basing your actions on science. I'll just stop there for a second and see what Richard has to add.
I'm involved at the moment in a rather curious controversy in New Zealand. I'm not sure whether you've read about this, but there's a rather serious, influential move in New Zealand to teach in science classes in New Zealand, not just science, but Maori so-called ways of knowing. And these ways of knowing are mythologies, which are no doubt beautiful and interesting and similar or of comparable value to mythologies around the world. Every country has its own mythology. And that's fine to teach in history classes or in, I don't know, in mythology, some aesthetic classes. But in science classes, as an exactly equal partner to scientific ways of knowing, it is ridiculous. And this has come to a head with a letter saying what I've just said, pretty much, to a New Zealand journal called The Listener, signed by half a dozen influential, distinguished New Zealand scientists, including fellows of the New Zealand Royal Society. And they have been censured and they've been threatened with expulsion from the New Zealand Royal Society because of what they said. Science, proper science, as opposed to mythological ways of knowing, has a glorious history. It's universal. It doesn't matter which part of the world you come from. It's still the same science. Science in Japan, in America, in France, in South America, and in New Zealand. It's the same science. It depends upon doing experiments, peer-reviewed papers, repeating experiments, double-blind trials, often in the case of medical experiments, testing of hypotheses that are from which mathematical deductions are made. This is all a universal thing. It's not local. It's not that New Zealand science is different from English science or Chinese science. It's all just science. And to elevate so-called ways of knowing, Maori ways of knowing, whatever other kinds of anthropological ways of knowing, is a travesty of science. And the New Zealand Royal Society is setting itself up for utter ridicule by this censure and threatening to expel members who fall for this ridiculous line.
Let me add to this, because there's a number of places where scientific organizations are now, it's happened in the United States. I just wrote an article about a group of anthropologists who were censored literally for saying that when it comes to scientific issues, indigenous creation myths should not be considered should not be competitive with our modern scientific understanding. But let me say this, and I think it's very important. It's not a disservice. Scientists aren't saying that these cultural histories should be ignored or forgotten or not appreciated. The understanding the Maori culture and the importance in New Zealand is incredibly important. Same with the indigenous stories and culture in North America. What people are saying is we should understand this as part of our human heritage. But just like we appreciate, let me give you an example. Just like we appreciate our childhood, we appreciate what our parents did for when we're children. And we may appreciate having believed in Santa Claus when we were younger as part of our cultural background and heritage. But that doesn't mean we have to believe in Santa Claus today. So we can understand these and we can say, isn't it wonderful that these different cultural heritages have come together and produced a society that's interesting, and a society which has now progressed in its understanding of the world. So we don't mean it as a disservice or demeaning to those cultures. We just say, look, the world is the way it is, and the same in science. Scientists have had beautiful ideas which have been proved to be wrong, and when they do, they recognize that they were the antecedents of something that worked better. And we don't, we know that quantum mechanics has replaced classical mechanics, but it doesn't mean we don't appreciate Newton.
I agree with you. Going further to this idea of science in public school education, there is a lot of science, and we cannot learn everything in school. And I was wondering if you have a view on this, on physics and biology. So if I talk to you, Lawrence, and I say, well, after a child finishes the school when he's or she is 18 years old, what should she or he know about physics? What are the things they should know in physics? 80% of the people, who are 18 years old, what should they know in physics? What are the subjects you would like them to know?
Well, what's really important for me is not so much the facts of science as the scientific process. I think that's what we need to teach in school, because that's the lifelong learning that will help people in the future. So the fact that you question, that you should be questioning yourself, that you should be questioning ideas you hear and test them and retest them and understand the easiest person to fool is yourself, and that that you constantly have to keep questioning, and you also other people can question, and so you shouldn't also be you should look for many sources of knowledge and not just try and confirm your own beliefs, but confront them, and that asking questions is a central part, that there's nothing wrong with asking questions about anything, that everything should be subject to question. Those are the kind of things we should be teaching, and then we can use the examples of physics to show how useful that is. As far as what people should understand about physics per se, I think that the very first thing we should understand is that the universe is remarkable, and that we continue to be surprised by what we discover. And if we stop looking out, then we'll stop learning. And beyond that, of course, you can pick and choose. I don't think we use examples of balls rolling down inclined planes and other things in physics classes, but that's just an example to show you how the tools of science can allow you to predict how the world works. And I certainly hope that in school that we don't just teach those things, we show how those same ideas help us understand, indeed, the dark energy that you talked about that I proposed in the beginning, and how all those basic ideas help you understand how the solar system works. I don't see Richard. I hope we haven't lost him. Oh, there he is. Oh, okay. I think we lost you, Richard. And connecting to audio. I was worried we lost Richard for a while. There you are. Richard, good. I was filling time while you were gone.
Oh, sorry. I'm back. Okay.
And in any case, what let me just summarize for you what I said in one sentence. I was asked what people should learn about physics, and I said the really important thing we should be teaching in school is the scientific process and how it works, because that will allow people a lifelong chance to understand and grow. The actual facts are not as important as learning about the process, and that and teaching them that the universe is truly remarkable and opening your eyes towards it. So that's basically what I said to fill in time.
I totally agree with that, and I would add, maybe you already said this, that science is just aesthetically wonderful. It's not just because it's useful. It's not just a method of finding out what's true about the universe. What is true about the universe is simply flabbergastingly, wonderfully, spellbindingly amazing. And this is conveyed by people like Carl Sagan and David Attenborough. The fact that since the Renaissance, we've gradually gained understanding of the universe, and we now understand so much. There's so much more to understand, so much we don't understand. And that's exciting too. But what we do already understand is wonderful, poetically wonderful. And that I would try to inspire people to grasp that, and not just to think of science as though usefulness is the only virtue that it has.
Let me add that,
Lawrence.
Let me just add that in addition to Carl Sagan and David Attenborough, I'd add Richard Dawkins to that list.
I would like to say that as well. But I also say, Lawrence, that biology has an advantage, I would say, to show this beauty. Sometimes we physicists, when we talk about the atom, have more difficulties in showing to the people how beautiful it is. The simple laws of the atom.
I'm not sure. It's interesting. Biologists have often talked about this. It is true that we teach in high school biology often before physics, which I think is a mistake, because biology is based on chemistry, which is based on physics, and it's a nice progression. Instead of requiring people to memorize facts, they can understand why things happen, which is more important. But but people are fascinated about physics in a way sometimes they aren't about biology, because biology seems complex. So everyone are fascinated with these kind of cosmic questions that, for better or worse, physicists are addressing. How did the universe begin? And looking out at the galaxies. And so we have the advantage, in some sense, in physics, of these beautiful Hubble Space Telescope pictures and other things. And so while biology is certainly much more direct, and it's certainly much more, in a sense, much more relevant to the day-to-day lives of people, everyone has those kind of cosmic questions, and we can play off those. And
I agree with that. Not only is that the wrong order, but even within biology, it's taught in the wrong order. If you look at a biology textbook, evolution is nearly always the last chapter in the book, which is ridiculous. It should be the first chapter in the book, because none of the rest makes sense. If you just simply told about cells, well, where do they come from? How are they made? Why are they so complex? You absolutely need evolution to start with before you can even begin to appreciate the rest of biology.
What did that famous biologist, I don't know, was it Haldane or someone else, said nothing in biology makes sense except in the context of evolution. Yeah.
So I would say, let's do an exercise and show people that science is beautiful. And let's talk about the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to be launched in a couple of weeks. So Lawrence, if you can tell us something about the physics of this of the telescope. And I was also looking to Richard, maybe he can tell us about possible discoveries of life in the universe, on exoplanets out there.
Okay, well, let's start with the telescope, which is going to launch later this month if all goes well. It's going to replace the Hubble Space Telescope, or at least enhance the Hubble Space Telescope. It's a telescope that's about 6 times as large radially. It's 6.5 meters in space, and therefore has much more than 10 times the strength of the Hubble Space Telescope. But what's more important is that there's 2 things. The Hubble Space Telescope is going in an orbit around the Earth, but the James Webb Space Telescope is going to be shot out a little over 1 million miles away from the Earth, and where it will be in an orbit that will constantly be shielded as it goes around, so it will never point towards the sun. It'll always be pointing away from the sun, and that will allow it to constantly be observing. But the really important thing is that the frequencies of light that it looks at are different than the Hubble Space Telescope, which looks at optical frequencies. It looks at what's called infrared radiation, which you can't see, but you can certainly feel as heat. And there's the reason it does that is there's twofold. One, as we look back in the earlier and earlier in the universe, it turns out because of the expansion of the universe, objects appear to be moving away from us faster and faster. And that causes the light from those objects to be stretched out. It's called redshifted. And if we want to look at the farthest objects away in the universe, we're looking at light that's so strongly redshifted that visible light actually turns into infrared radiation by the time we see it. So one of the reasons the Space Telescope was built was to look at the very first objects forming in the universe, which for people like me is quite interesting because we can learn about the first stars and galaxies and how we came to be. And that's certainly one of the strong purposes of the James Webb Space Telescope. But almost as a side effect, but for many people even more important, is the fact that when we look at stars like the sun, they emit radiation in the visible band. But if you look at the Earth...
Sorry, could you say that again? My apologies.
My phone wants me to talk again. But anyway, when we look at the Earth is emitting an infrared radiation, because we have a temperature such that the radiation coming out of the Earth is in infrared. And that means if you're looking to look at planets, to actually see and get direct information from planets around other stars, you want a telescope that's sensitive to infrared radiation. And that's what makes the James Webb Space Telescope so great. First, its resolving power, because it's so big, is important. But secondly, it's sensitive to the radiation that's emitted by planets. And so we hope it'll be an incredible tool to allow us to learn about the nature of planets and the potential for life. And I'll leave it there and for Richard to talk a little bit about life, and then maybe I'll come back and give some of my views.
Okay, well, this is a topic that interests me greatly. Incidentally, random little fact: snakes have sense organs, especially for seeing infrared.
There we go. Exactly.
Okay, never mind about that. Okay, exoplanetary life. It's only relatively recently we've even known that stars other than the sun have planets, and now we know that perhaps, I don't know, maybe even all stars, maybe a very large number.
Almost all stars have planets. We think,
have planets. So the number of possibilities for places where life could originate has shot up in our estimation. When people talk about life outside this one, we often jump straight to thinking about intelligent life, such as might visit us or listen to our radio chatter or send us radio signals, that kind of thing. Excuse me. Much more likely, of course, is life on a sort of bacterial level. So in order to progress to the kind of life that we could ever know about, say by radio, it's got to get through lots of barriers. On this planet, a big barrier was the origin of the eukaryotic cell, the sort of complex cell of which we're made, and plants are made, and animals are made, as opposed to bacteria, which have a simpler kind of cell, the prokaryotic cell. It's slightly easy, well, it is easier to imagine a prokaryotic cell arising than anything else. So something like a bacterium. It's not that improbable that life has origin elsewhere. Some think it is. I mean, some people think that we are literally unique in the universe in having life. If you want to believe that, you have to understand that you're committed then to the view that the origin of life on this planet was quite stupefyingly improbable, because the number of planets in the universe, I don't know what the current estimate is, maybe 10 to the 22, something like that.
That's a good number.
Then for this to be the only planet that has life, you've got to believe that something happened on this planet, which is so staggeringly improbable that we're wasting our time trying to replicate it in the lab. It wouldn't happen. Well, I don't believe that. I think that it's not that improbable, which in turn commits me to the view that there is plenty of life in the universe, maybe only bacterial life. And then we have to ask the question, how likely is it to advance to something like intelligent life, which might be via multicellularity? But then we have to start asking questions, how much of what we know about life on this planet, like say multicellularity, just happens to be true here? Or how much of it just has to be true because that's the only way for life to be? For example, does it has to have some kind of genetics? The answer, I'm sure, is yes. Does it have to be Darwinian? I'm pretty sure it does. I'm pretty sure that I stick my neck out anyway and say that if there is life elsewhere, it's got to be Darwinian life in some sense. It's got to be due to the non-random survival of some kind of coded information. Does that coded information have to be digital, like our genetics is? Our genetics is deeply digital. Not only Mendelian genetics is digital, but Watson-Crick DNA type genetics is digital, highly digital. It's just like a chromosome is just like a really great long computer tape. So that's another question. Does it have to be digital? I guess it does. But some might argue for some kind of analog coding system. I think that wouldn't work. I think that wouldn't be sufficiently accurate to encode for life and natural selection, but that's an arguable point. Does there have to be something like sex? Probably not, because we don't have sex in all forms of life on this planet. Some kind of reshuffling of the genetic information, whatever it is, does that have to happen? Does the genetic information have to be a linear code stretched in a linear array like a chromosome, or could it be, say, two-dimensional rather than one-dimensional? Unlikely to be three-dimensional, because then it's very hard to read. But both two-dimensional and one-dimensional genetic information can be read. We know how it's read on this planet. Amazingly, we know in incredible detail exactly what the genetic code is and exactly how it's read. Does extraterrestrial life have to be based on DNA? Almost certainly not. Does it have to be based on something that does the same job as DNA? Almost certainly yes. All these are fascinating questions which can be sort of hypothetically answered, long before we actually have any direct information about other kinds of life.
Let me jump in and say, when we talk about life, often we use a word which I don't like to use in science, which is believe, and because we really don't know about the possibilities. We know one example. We know life on Earth. But what's wonderful about this is that people can have different views about whether life is rare or not. But the great thing is in science, we don't just rely on that. And the great thing is that we're living in a time when we may soon, and most importantly, answer the question. And that's what makes it so exciting, is that not just with the James Webb Space Telescope, but as Richard pointed out, and I certainly agree, I think it's there's no doubt it's more likely that there's much more, even if there's life elsewhere in the universe, there's much more life in the universe than there is intelligent life. It took 4 billion years or so for us to arise on Earth, and we're very fortunate that there were no major catastrophes on the way, no major things that destroyed life on Earth. But that means one of the exciting things is we may not have to look out just at the far reaches of the universe to find life. When it comes to simple kinds of life, we may see it in our solar system. There are a variety of locations, and of course Mars gets a lot of attention because it may have been hot and wet. But in the oceans of Europa and Enceladus, which are frozen moons, we now know there are warm oceans inside with even organic materials. And what's really important about those is they've been isolated from us. You see, at Mars, if we find life there, well, rocks from Mars could have come to the Earth and rocks from Earth could have come to Mars, so they could have polluted each other. But if we're lucky enough to discover primordial, let's say bacterial or simple life in the oceans of Europa or Enceladus, that will tell us that life is abundant everywhere. And there are experiments. We're building machines to be able to go and drill in those oceans. So that's one thing I want to say. And the other is that obviously I can't disagree with anything that Richard said. My suspicion is that life, if we see it elsewhere, will be remarkably similar to the life that we see. I suspect that biology will have discovered the rules of physics and chemistry that are maybe potentially unique or very close to being unique to make a self-replicating, life as we describe it. But what I'm also so I think that's my guess. But my other guess is, based on everything I've ever experienced about science, is that we will be surprised. Because every time we look out at the universe, we're surprised. So if we discover the life, I suspect we'll discover the varieties of possibilities exceed our own human imagination. And that's why we have to keep looking out rather than just thinking inward.
That would be another demonstration of the fact that science is an art, because art surprises you, and science will do as well.
Yes, can I say a bit more about this? Well, if there is multicellular, large-scale life, sort of big things like us, then you can start asking questions like, will they have eyes? Will they have wings? Will they have feet? Will they have wheels? And there we can get some insight by looking at life on this planet, because you can say, how many times have eyes evolved independently on this planet? And it's a lot. It's several dozen times, maybe 30 times. Eyes have evolved independently. That's just a strong pressure to evolve organs that can, in some ways, focus beams of light to make images. Will they have wings? Well, wings have evolved 4 times, only 4 times, I would say. Echolocation, sonar. If a planet doesn't have, say, if a planet is shrouded in perpetual fog so that eyes aren't any good, I would expect echoes to be used, as they are by bats and whales, toothed whales, and also 2 independent families of birds. So echolocation has got a good chance of arising, especially in a planet that's completely shrouded in fog. So we can use insights from comparative study of zoology on this planet to say what kind of pressure there is to evolve this, very high to evolve eyes, or that, wheels, very low pressure to evolve wheels. They haven't evolved at all. Well, maybe once or twice in the living world.
And let me go on. I know we're spending longer on this question than you planned, but it doesn't matter. It's interesting. We also can use not just the knowledge of biology to speculate on this, but the knowledge of physics. For example, most most stars in the universe are much smaller than our sun, and therefore emit. And it turns out the radiation they emit is in a different. It's not quite the same as the spectrum of light emitted by our sun. So our eyes have evolved, of course, to see visible light because that's the light that gets to us. We would fully expect, for example, if life evolved on planets around dwarf stars, that obviously that their kind of eyes would be sensitive to different frequencies. So that's the kind of thing we can also think about, as well as recognizing that there are other physical factors that may change the parameters of life. The last thing I will say, having said all this about regular life, I do think that probably intelligent life is rare, but there's so many, as Richard's pointed out, there's so many solar systems. Pretty well every star we know has a solar system, which is something we expected as astrophysicists before we even discovered it empirically. There's so many solar systems that I suspect there is intelligent life elsewhere, even in our galaxy. But alas, just to make it clear, our galaxy is a big place. And even if there's intelligent life in our galaxy, the likelihood of knowing about it is very, very small. And people shouldn't expect that people shouldn't expect the absence of evidence to be evidence of absence, as Carl Sagan would have said. And the last thing I will say is the laws of in spite of the fact that there may be intelligent life elsewhere, and as much as I'd like to communicate with it, as much as I'd like to visit it or it to visit us, the laws of physics also tell us that's not happening. It's just so I know people are infatuated with UFOs, but the laws of physics tell us that the physical constraints on being able to travel between stars and us in any reasonable amount of time are such that it really is so unlikely, and that's all we can say as scientists, so unlikely is that almost any other explanation of what people see is more probable.
I agree with that completely. We're not going to be visited, but we might just about pick up radio signals. I'm going to ask Lawrence, since radio signals which are beamed would be just as improbable as being visited, but radio signals that radiate out in all directions would be much more probable, unless they dissipate so much by the inverse square law that they. I mean, is it likely that any civilization could produce sufficient energy to broadcast in all directions a great increasing sphere of information that it could travel the huge distances involved?
It turns out yeah. The answer is yes. It turns out radio signals are remarkably detectable. As I like to tell someone, if you want to understand it, with the Arecibo radio telescope is now no longer. It used to be in Puerto Rico. It was a beautiful radio telescope and built in the jungle. It could have detected a light bulb on Pluto in the radio band. I mean, that kind of, and so we can detect radio signals very effectively from even very far distances, even if they're not beamed. But there are many, many problems, and one of the problems is quite simply, what signal are you looking for and what channel are you listening to? When I try and watch TV, the rare times I do, there's so many channels I usually can't find what I was looking for. And in the real universe, there are an infinite number of frequencies. And so you have to, if you're really looking for life, you have to scan millions or billions of different frequencies of radio waves at the same time as trying to say what is a signal and what is noise. And that computationally, and it's an extreme bit of difficulty, but I agree with you, Richard. While I think it's rare, it's worth doing because the payoff is so profound if we hear something.
Yes.
Yes, the hour is almost gone. We didn't take the questions from the audience, and we still have one more question, one more point of discussion, which is free speech in universities. If you would like to address that, or you would like to take questions from the audience.
I personally like to take questions from the audience. The only thing I'd say is that free speech and open inquiry is essential to universities, it's essential to human progress, and we should just support that wherever possible. But other than that, I have nothing to add.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question from Nicolae Diaconu, who says the following: how can humans cope with the fear of missing out? especially for scientists of high status as a speakers. How do you cope with the fact that you will miss out in the future the possibility of humanity discovering the secrets of the universe and knowing the answers to questions' biggest mysteries? Like you are going to miss the 42. How do you cope with this fact?
Richard, you start.
Well, yes, I mean, it would be very nice to learn the secret of everything, and it's probably going to happen after we're gone, and that's just very sad. But meanwhile, it's great fun learning what we do know and trying to find out more.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there'll be lots of things that'll be discovered when we're gone. But first of all, I celebrate how lucky I am to be around at a time when we know as much as we do. I've benefited so much from the work of people before me, and I'm so lucky to be around at a time when all of these things are happening. Plus, I have to say, for me, the searching is often more fun than the finding. And so I don't think there'll be a theory of everything, by the way, and I think that's fine. I love the idea of mysteries, and I think mysteries excite people, and I hope that there continue to be mysteries as long as there are people looking at those mysteries.
How can there not be a theory of everything? I mean, the universe has got to make sense, hasn't it? And
it does, Richard. But what I mean is, it could be, and Richard Feynman said, it could be that nature's like an onion, and each layer as you peel back. So at the level that we can experience, there are certainly laws that govern what we can see. For the most part, we know all those laws. We already know, even though we don't have a quantum theory of gravity, we know how gravity works at our scale. We know electromagnetism. We know the laws that govern chemistry and biology. But it could be that as each scale, as we look smaller and smaller, new laws are unveiled. They may be irrelevant for understanding what happens at our scale, but they may be fundamental to if you want to have a complete description of nature. So there may be a certain scale at which you really determine the fundamental laws that determine everything. But it could be that at every scale, those laws derive from yet other laws, and both are logical possibilities. And
I could believe that our brains, which are evolved to do rather mundane things on the African plains, are not equipped to understand these great depths of mystery. And why on earth should they be? I mean, the remarkable thing is that brains that evolved just to sort of hunt zebras and look for waterholes and things can actually do quantum physics. I mean, that is amazing. Astonishing tribute to our species, which is unique, totally unique in that respect. So I believe that there could very well be mysteries that are simply beyond the human brain to understand. But ultimately, there's got to be an explanation, even if we
but what we've learned, and this is a hard concept to cross, is that the explanations may change as scale changes. For example, we know that on small scales, not just quantum mechanics, the universe behaves quite differently than we see and experience it. We know at a fundamental scale the elementary particles that make you and I up don't have any mass. So it could be, it's logically possible that at ever smaller microscopic scales, the universe actually behaves quite differently. And the laws that describe that behavior is quite different. And yet it doesn't impact on us. But it could be that there are, once we get small enough, there is one set of laws that describe everything. And I think a lot of physicists would suspect that that's likely, but I guess as the eternal agnostic, I'm willing to allow either possibility. But let me also say that I'm more optimistic than you. I see no barriers to human understanding because, as far as I can see, mathematics is the language of nature. And we don't know if it will be forever. But as long as it's the language of nature, human beings appear to be able to comprehend mathematics. And I'm optimistic. I doubt that there'll be a barrier where we finally say that nature is incomprehensible. But the great thing is we'll wait and see. And the only way to find out is to keep trying.
Alexandru wants to know, what do you think about the theory that we may be living in a simulation?
Yeah, let me start on that one, because I think it's got a lot, there are movies and everyone likes the idea and it's romantic, but I think it's a silly idea, frankly. First of all, for two reasons. One is that simulations always have flaws in them, and that would mean pixels that don't work. And as far as we can tell, there's no place that we've ever seen where the laws of nature don't work, except maybe inside the brain of the former president of this country, but or the United States. But so that's one aspect that suggests to me we're not in a simulation. But the other thing is, first of all, as a physicist, it doesn't matter to me because I'm interested in the laws of physics that govern the world that I experience. And so I want to know about those laws regardless of whether they're in a simulation. But more important is really almost an evolutionary reason. Well, if we're in a simulation, then what about the beings that simulated us? They're presumably more complex than us. Are they a simulation and yet a more complex simulation? Is it simulations all the way down? And so it begs the fundamental question. If someone say our world is so complex, it must be simulated. Well, it's like God. The simulators must have been more complex still. What happened to them? So I don't think it addresses the fundamental question of laws of nature, or life, or anything else. I'd like to hear what Richard has to say.
Well, you don't have to suppose that it goes on all the way down. I mean, there could just be one. The evolution of a spectacularly intelligent group of people who simulate. One version of this theory is that the simulation is actually done by our own people in the future. Yeah. And so which is an interesting one. And
again, that of course requires the possibility of time travel, and we can talk about
not
that.
Really. I mean, sort of, but it's not logically impossible, and I think that's. Some people think it's not only possible but almost inevitable.
Oh, I see what you mean.
But I don't think that. I have sometimes wondered when you think what a spectacular computer the human brain is, small as it is. I mean, it's a very small object, and when you think of what it can do, what it can remember, it's not something we understand how it's done at the moment. Could it be that rather like an iPhone, where the iPhone appears to be being clever, but actually what's being clever is a vast computing apparatus that it's communicating with elsewhere. So a version of the simulation hypothesis would be that when we appear to be being clever, when we appear to be knowing so much, we're just downloading stuff from the master computer that's simulating us.
I suppose so. I find that, again, much less exciting, interesting. Plus, I would have to say, if you look at simulations that we can create even as in our infancy, in our computer infancy now, it's almost the same question you can ask as we get often asked about God. But if I were creating a simulation, I would certainly have created a simulation where I'd have superpowers, where I wouldn't breathe with the same tool that I eat with, and all those same reasons we could talk about design. I think if it's really like saying, if you were a simulator, you'd certainly design better beings than us.
I agree. Yeah. I don't actually believe the simulation hypothesis, I should say.
Yeah. Marius would like to know your opinion about the cause for the religious beliefs. Are all the billions of people from the past, present, and probably future delusional when believing in something beyond the physical reality?
Yes, I think they are. And the mere fact that they're very numerous doesn't impress me. What we have to look at is the strength of the arguments, and the strength of the arguments in favor of some kind of God, divine intelligence, are extremely weak. Some people say, well, what about Isaac Newton? He believed. Well, of course he did. He lived before Darwin. I've even written down, it was very difficult to be an atheist before Darwin. But now I won't say it's actually easy, because it's still a mind-bogglingly complicated thing to believe that life especially, actually, with its profound illusion of purpose, came about by the laws of physics just working through natural selection. Nevertheless, that is a more economical theory than the theory that there is a divine intelligence, which itself demands an explanation. It's like what Lawrence was saying a moment ago about the infinite regress. Even if, to follow one kind of science fiction-y idea of Francis Crick, that maybe life was seeded on this planet by some kind of intelligent intelligence on another planet sending a rocket with DNA. That intelligence has to have evolved from somewhere. You cannot go on going backwards. You've got to have an explanation. And so to postulate a God who is capable of designing a universe, including life, that God itself would have to be supremely complicated. And therefore, to postulate that would be to, as it were, deny the whole of science. I mean, the whole of evolutionary science, which is explaining how you can get complicated illusions of design from nothing, from very, very simple beginnings. Evolution does that. It's a stupendously successful idea, and it literally does it. Then if you want to say, oh, well, God just did it, you pull the rug out from the whole of the scientific enterprise, which is explaining things, really, really explaining things. We can explain how complexity arises out of simplicity. To postulate God, which is a supreme complexity, is simply to give up, to cave in, to lie down under the problem and say, I don't know how it was done, God did it. That is pathetic.
Well, yeah, okay. Let me add to what Richard said a little bit. Actually, use an example from him, because of course I agree with him about the delusion of right now of a kind of divine being. But but that's not to suggest the delusion has had useful purposes. The reason religion is so ubiquitous in humanity is not that people are naturally delusional, but we all want to believe for a reason. And Richard's pointed out, and on others, the certainly there are clear evolutionary reasons for assuming purpose. And the simplest example, which I think I did first learn from Richard, is in the savannah in early Africa, if the tree, you have people and you have trees rustling, and you can either assume there's a purpose for that, there may be a lion behind that, or you can assume there's no purpose, and the people who assumed no purpose got eaten by the lions and didn't reproduce. And so we have clearly evolutionary reasons to want to believe, as Fox Mulder from the X-Files would say. And if you get it in Romania, I don't know if you get that TV show. But and so we have a built-in desire to believe. And moreover, in the absence of science, religion provided explanations that at least allowed societies to try and progress, and often in inappropriate ways, we would say nowadays, but also it provided a method for cohesiveness, for sometimes forcefully holding people together. So religion, the propagation of religion is certainly understandable from a human perspective, and it's not to suggest that human beings are stupid for having had religious beliefs in any way. It's all understandable. The great thing is that we've been able to progress beyond those beliefs and explain that the sun rises for the reason it does, that the earth goes around the sun and the other way around. And so we've been able to grow out of religion, is the way I would say it. And so it's to understand that, and people should understand that their desire for meaning and belief is something that comes naturally, and shouldn't feel bad about that. But neither should they feel bad, and this is the really important thing, I think, when it comes to religion, neither should they feel bad about questioning that belief, because that's really the most important thing. And so it's a combination, I guess. That's all I'd add to what Richard said.
Thank you very much. Because the hour
I can't hear you.
Now you should hear me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Because the hour is up, I have two last questions, which I put them at once, and you might answer as you like. These are going to be the last two questions. So the first one is, what advice would you give to prospective scientists watching this? And the second one is, what excites you and worries you most looking at the state of the world, society as it is today?
Wow. Richard, do you want to go first or last? Okay.
I hate that question.
Okay. Well, the advice I give to young people is to, first of all, if you're talented in science, just continue to do it. Continue to ask questions. And don't, as I like to say, don't let the bastards get you down. Just keep remembering why you're interested. And all the rest of the stuff, which can often get in the way, try and have it get in the way as little as possible. And keep your mind open to being surprised and to being wrong. That's the most exciting thing that a scientist can experience, because it means there's more to learn. As far as fear and excitement, I agree it's a difficult thing. I'm both fearful and excited by the potentiality of human beings, I guess. I see them at their best. It's like Hamlet said, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, etc. But at the same time, we as a species apparently have a difficult time dealing with, because of the new situation the world is in, with global problems, from pandemics to global climate change, and our ability to destroy ourselves in different ways. So I'm excited and fearful, but for me, that's a part of life. Life is full of risks and fears, but I don't close my mind to it. I think the most exciting thing you can do is go out in spite of those and realize the great potential for wonder and excitement. And so that's how I get through the day.
I totally agree with every word of that. And I suppose I just add that the things that we need to be fearful of, things like climate change, if there is going to be a solution, science will provide it. And so the excitement is part of the sort of hope that for the future, science will deliver, as it has delivered in the past, and will deliver solutions to the problems that we face. If you ask me what's exciting me about biology and why should a young person go into biology, I would say biology has got incredibly exciting since 1953, when, as I said earlier, it was realized that it's really all digital coding. The analogy between modern molecular biology and computer science is very, very close. And it's astonishing the repercussions that this has. It has repercussions in my own field of evolutionary biology. It promises to allow us to put together the entire tree of life, the entire relationship of every species to every other species. Excuse me. In the field of, we talked about vaccination earlier. The fact that the various vaccines were produced so stunningly quickly within a year is entirely due to the fact that molecular biology enabled people immediately to sequence the virus, to sequence the RNA code of the virus. And that immediately unlocked the possibility of developing vaccines. So, excuse me, science is exciting. Science is beautiful, aesthetically beautiful. It's the poetry of reality, and it may well be what saves us.
That's beautiful, Richard. And I wouldn't even speak up. I know we both tried to be profound at the end, but I've also read a note from our host that it was apparently publicized that this would go on for a little longer, a total of an hour and a half, and there are still lots of questions. So I don't mind fulfilling what was announced. And even though we tried to end profoundly, I'm happy to be more pedestrian and answer some more questions.
Well, if so, I will continue.
Except we can't hear you,
questions.
Cristian. Oh, okay.
Now probably well.
Okay.
And there is a delay, one way or another, on the line.
Okay.
So this is a question for you. Is there any progress in explaining the vacuum catastrophe? The vacuum decay, I suppose. Thanks.
Oh, it's a question for me. Okay. Well,
yes.
Well, look, physicists describe the universe and the state from which everything evolves from, and everything, the excited particles and all the rest. We call the state from which we're built on. We call the vacuum state, just to make that clear as a bit of jargon. And it's happened in the history of the universe that the state on which everything is built has changed. And it's like a house of cards. Everything changes. If you get rid of the floor, then everything changes. And it's happened several times in the history of the universe that we know of, where the fundamental basis on which everything's built changes. As I mentioned to Richard earlier, we know that at a very high temperature in the early history of the universe, elementary particles didn't have mass. So there couldn't have been anything like atoms or anything like that. But then things changed, and the vacuum changed, as we say. And in this case, something called the Higgs field formed in the universe, which causes the universe to have its properties the way it does. And the question is the state on which everything we see is based now going to change? And the answer, of course, is we don't know. The good news is if it changed, the effects would be that everything we would see would probably disappear, but would happen at the speed of light, so you'd never know what hit you. So the universe, as we now know it, would kind of end, but we would never see it coming. But it doesn't need to be the case. In fact, for fun once, I described a way. It turns out this energy in empty space is the biggest mystery, as you mentioned, and as I was happy to play a role in that. But we don't know what it's due to, and one worry is that it may go away, and the process of going away change the properties of the universe, but it may not. And I actually once wrote a paper showing how it could go away without destroying the universe. So I was very happy, at least on paper, to save the universe. But nature may choose otherwise.
Another question from Razvan. How probable do you think it is for our human race to get to the level of understanding that will allow us to go forward and survive, to unveil the secrets of the universe, versus self-destruct before reaching that point? Climate change, wars, and so on.
Richard, you can start. I can't hear you. You're muted, I think.
It's a common feature a common idea in science fiction that as civilizations reach a sufficiently advanced level of technology that we might know about them, they disappear because they destroy themselves in some kind of catastrophic. Well, it might be climate change, it might be a total war, and so it may be that all over the universe there are little civilizations winking in and out, and the time they last may be a couple of centuries of our time. So that time is too short. But it's unlikely that time would last long enough for us to communicate with them. So that's a pessimistic, slightly humorous in a dark sort of way view, and it's looking not unlikely in our case. And I suppose you could make a theoretical case that it's quite likely in any civilization.
Let me just say, I'll put on my optimist hat, which is probably a little artificial, but I'll put it on anyway. I was involved for a long time in something called the Bolton the Atomic Scientists, which set something called the Doomsday Clock, and every year I used to set it for a decade, about how close we are to midnight with the human potential for destruction of a civilization due to new technology. Having said that, however, there may be reason to hope. I mean, the best of us, science reveals a lot, and one could argue in many ways that science has improved not just the quantity of life and the quality of our life directly, but the quality of our intellectual life. That science has helped demonstrate and make the world a better place, demonstrate that certain ideas are ridiculous, and that we can maybe communicate more effectively and understand each other and empathize with each other. So science can make us better, as well as produce threats. And we have been living with the most horrific threat that I know of. I'm kind of amazed in a way for almost 80 years since the development of nuclear weapons. And we have so far not destroyed ourselves. So there is some possibility, there is some potential hope that we'll get through this, that maybe we'll live in a Star Trek future where we'll look back at this 20th and 21st centuries as infancies of the human experience. I'd like that to be the case. I'm not. It's not necessarily an expectation, but it's a nice possibility.
I suppose. I mean, I agree with that. I suppose the problem is that the solution lies in politics, not in science. And so, as scientists go on producing ever more powerful ways of doing good things and doing bad things, it's up to politicians to come to the right conclusion and not to use them. And I'm more optimistic about the future of science than I am about the future of politics.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think the way we need to do that is ensure that politicians are better scientists. And I don't mean that they're scientists per se. I mean that they think like they use the processes of science to determine how to make policy. So we all should. I mean, if there's an action item here, we should all be working to those of us in parliamentary in democracies where we can elect people. We should all be working hard to elect the kind of people who in terms of public policies act like scientists.
Yeah.
And even
it's time for Congress. lot of
Yeah,
sound for
yeah,
Congress.
well, anyway, and let me even say for people who may be watching in societies where you don't openly elect your governments still often don't lead; they respond. And if there's a significant public, once there's greater than a certain fraction of the public that strongly wants something, no matter what really the society is based on, the government structure, governments tend to react because they like to remain in power. So anyway. But
on the same line, I have a question from Flavius, who says the following: should theories of ethics be taught in schools as well? It would be possible that the next evolutionary jump for humans to be from Homo sapiens to Homo moralis. Does Mr. Richard sees moral enhancement the next evolutionary step?
Well, yes. I mean, we're very nice to advance to Homo moralis. That's unlikely to come about by ordinary evolutionary steps, because evolution is a rather immoral process, but it has to come about by cultural steps, by culturally society taking a decision to be more moral. And education is obviously a very good thing. We have disciplines of moral philosophy which study ethical questions, and they use principles like the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and so on. Sentientism, respect for all sentient life, not just human life. These moral principles would be extremely nice to at least expose children to. So yes, I would be in favor of ethical education along with scientific education.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it was a question more for Richard than me, but I will just add that, yeah, as long as the education is done in a similar way, namely understanding ethics by asking questions rather than understanding ethics by telling people what's right and wrong. I don't think that ever works. By getting people to question their own moral situation and ultimately, hopefully, use reason to help guide their ethics, then I think it's a great thing to do in schools.
Sylvie wants to know, do you believe that someone can be honestly a scientist and a priest at the same time?
Well, of course. Once again, I never like to use the word belief because I don't believe things are either likely or unlikely, and what tells me whether they're true or not is experiment. And you can do the experiment. One of the persons who developed the modern theory of the Big Bang was a Catholic priest. He was a very good physicist. And what he did was, when he did physics. And I don't know what he did when he was a priest, but he managed to be able to do it. What?
Was he honest? I mean, that's the question. He was certainly, Lemaitre was a very good physicist, but could he have been a good physicist? He was really, really honest. I mean, I know of a case, I can't name him, but a professor of astronomy in America who writes learned papers in astrophysics that assume the universe is, whatever it is, 13.8 billion years old, and does his mathematics, everything on that basis. But he privately believes that the universe is only 6,000 years old. Now, that is dishonest. That is, in no way could you call that honest. And that's an extreme...
No, I think...
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably true, but I think the point is that reason is a slave of passion, in the sense that I think people being people tend to have many contradictory beliefs at the same time.
That's
and we
dishonest,
don't, and most of us,
dishonest.
Well, it is, but it's a property of being a human being. But I suspect, I'm going to give Lemaitre a little more, I suspect that his God was the God of Spinoza. I never heard him say that.
No, I suspect that.
But I suspect that he believed in some order in the universe, but as a priest probably couldn't say it. So I guess he was being dishonest. But the bottom line is that to be fairer, there are well-known scientists who call themselves religious, and they may be fooling themselves in one way or another, but it's certainly not true that to be a productive scientist you have to be an atheist.
Oh no, that's certainly it.
And it's also at the same time, however, and I do believe this was Haldane who said this, I think, the biologist, who said it is true, however, that when you go in the laboratory you have to be an atheist, in the sense you you're assuming that the results of your experiments are based on laws of nature and not being, and the dials and knobs of your experiment are not being twiddled by some divine being. So if you're a religious person, when you go in the laboratory, you have to be willing to let nature determine the answers and not have them preordained.
But if you then don't believe it on Sunday, you're being dishonest, and that was the question.
Yeah.
And you're perfectly right, I'm sure, that many so-called religious scientists are actually just kind of spiritual, like Einstein. Einstein did not believe in a personal God. And you're trying to exonerate Lemaitre by saying maybe he didn't either. In that case, why was he a Catholic priest? Catholic priests are committed to the view that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus redeemed our sins, that we're born of original sin, Jesus was born of a virgin, Jesus rose from the dead. All that cannot be seriously held by a scientist. And therefore, it's one thing to believe in Spinoza's God. It's another thing to be a Catholic priest.
I agree. I agree with you in what you explicitly said. On the other hand, I guess I'm going to be a little more sympathetic to all of us, with the exception of maybe you, Richard, and I know you well. But the rest of us tend to often believe 12 impossible things before breakfast in order to get through the day. So somehow it helps us get through the day to believe that our job is useful or that we're beautiful or whatever, that also may be equally fallacious.
Okay, so it's pardonable to be dishonest, then, is what you're saying.
I guess at some level, and in fact, actually, here's the really important point about this that makes it really important. I mean, all of us probably believe some delusional things, but what really matters is what governs our actions more than anything else. And so I don't care what people believe at some level, unless their belief governs their actions in bad ways. So when it comes to actions, I'd like it to be based on reality and not on fairy tales.
4 more minutes, 2 questions. There are many physics questions. I don't know why, so I'll take one physics.
I told you, people like
question.
physics. I don't know. Anyway.
Surprisingly. Could dark energy be actually a new type of particle impossible to observe by the current particle colliders we have now, or is it clear a form of pure energy? I suppose he's referring to modified Newtonian dynamics or something else.
Well, look, that's a technical question. I'm sure most of the listeners are not that interested in it, but I'll give a brief answer. And the point is that there's something fundamentally different. The reason dark energy, which is this energy of empty space, is so interesting, is it at a fundamental scale, the kind of energy that's involved is not the kind of energy associated with particles or radiation or anything else. So it can't be a kind of elementary particle, even one that we haven't seen, because the energy it produces, that the energy it contains, is gravitationally repulsive. And general relativity tells us that the only kind of thing that can be gravitationally repulsive and have energy is empty space. Particles cannot have that kind of energy. So we know it's something fundamentally different than anything we've measured, which is why it's so exciting, because it's not, unlike dark matter, which is the stuff that appears to dominate the mass of our galaxy, which we think is most likely some new type of elementary particle we just can't see. Dark energy is something fundamentally different, and we don't understand it at all. And as I tried to indicate before, that makes it even more exciting, because not understanding, if you're a scientist, is much more exciting than understanding at some level, because it means not only is there a lot to learn, but it gives some kind of job security, I suppose, as well.
And the last question became 2 questions.
I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
And the last question became 2 questions, but very shortly. One is, could eating unhealthy food, for example, become a winning evolutionary trait if more people do so? That would be the first one. And the second one, how likely is it that we visit our neighbor solar system, Alpha Centauri, within our lifetime?
You take the first one, Richard. I'll take the second. So how does that sound?
I think that it's too ordinary and mundane a question to finish up on. I'd rather hand over to you, Lawrence, on the more.
Okay. Well, the answer is, in our lifetime, that humans are not going to be visiting Alpha Centauri in our lifetime. That we may be able to send very small robotic spacecraft, and I mean very small, gram-sized objects or smaller, to get to velocities that may be 10% of the speed of light, which would mean it would be 100 years or so, or maybe 20% of the speed of light, maybe 100 years to get to Alpha Centauri. So I can imagine it's possible in my lifetime, not likely, but possible, that we may send robotic spacecraft, which in a period of a 10 years might get, 100 years might get to the nearest star. But humans are not going to be, unfortunately, traveling through the galaxy in my lifetime. And I suspect, if I were going to make a prediction, and as I often say, I only generally make predictions that are 2 trillion years in the future, because then no one will be around to check them in any case. But I think humans are unlikely to ever travel through the galaxy in a single human lifetime. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that's never going to happen. Maybe possible that we will have a vast island spaceships that go slowly if once the Earth is potentially dying and seek other worlds, that may be possible. We'll see. It looks like Richard wants to say something.
All too easy to forget how enormous these distances are compared to the distances within the solar system. Within the solar system, this is peanuts. I mean, it's just nothing compared to the distance, even to Alpha Centauri, let alone to start traveling to other parts of the galaxy. The distances are simply gigantic, which was one reason why Lawrence was right to say, rather sadly, it's unlikely that if there is life elsewhere, we will ever encounter it. There could be 1,000 different life forms in the galaxy. And there could be 1 billion different life forms in the galaxy. And it'd still be so spaced out that we might never encounter them.
And that very, very well said, Richard. And let me try and end on a more optimistic note than I just said, in the sense that we shouldn't despair that we may never travel around the galaxy like the stars and ships in Star Trek. Because what we can do is, what is still equally more remarkable to me, is that stuck here on planet Earth, using science and technology, we've been able to learn about the universe and probe the universe to the farthest scales. We talked about the James Webb Space Telescope. We'll soon be able to maybe see the first stars that ever formed in the universe. We can explore with our robotic probes our solar system. So stuck here on Earth, we're not helpless. We can still learn and be exposed to the entire universe, and so we should not despair that we're not traveling out there. We can experience and learn about it here, and that is the beauty and wonder of science, which excites me, and which my good friend and colleague Richard Dawkins has written about and inspired millions to enjoy.
So, Richard, is this a nice way to finish this presentations? I think so. I think that, as you said, science is an art, and both of you demonstrated today that scientists can be artists as well. I would really like to thank you on behalf of the whole Romanian community, who watches this out, and also thank again the Romanian American University for making this possible. Unless you want to add something else, thank you again very much.
Thank you to everyone who listened, and thank you.
It's been an unusual pleasure. Thank you very much.
Truly, it's been wonderful. Thanks again.
You're welcome. See you then. Have a nice day further.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.